Hello and welcome back to the Five Factors Podcast. I am Tal Prince. I'm here with my favorite fire starter in the entire world, Matt Adair. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing well. I am now beginning to write in my head a song called Kerosene Blues.
Oh, yes. That should be awesome, and great fuel for us to use for our discussion today. What we're going to talk about today is secret number 12. We're going to ask a question, and that question is simply, should men learn from women? Been a lot of
The,
talk about this. Been a lot of
yeah,
talk
the,
about
the
this.
answer is yes. So we're done, right?
Shortest podcast
Yeah, we're
in the
out.
series. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Rate, review, tell your friends.
But here, seriously, y'all, the reason I think we're jumping into this is we want to help you reimagine who you learn from.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about the five factors, we talk about our vocational health. When we talk about our development as leaders, particularly church leaders and pastors, and the way that a lot of us have been trained, we think about our relationships and how we relate to other people. I think that we have been done a disservice, and I think we're doing a disservice to others when we limit so much of our training and development as church leaders, as men, to men. So if you're a woman pastor, if you are a woman who is leading in the church, this is gonna be like, well, obvious, boys, but we're trying to help. We're trying to help the other gender, y'all. So it's a conversation with men. Ladies, we'd love for you to chime in, but we're just trying to figure this out. So here's the setup, right? So last month, Dr. John Piper, who has had seasons where he's been significantly influential on me, he said in a Q&A session that he didn't believe that women should serve as seminary professors. Now, caveat, he can believe whatever he wants, right? I mean,
Yes, he can.
that's not our responsibility. And he has a very narrow view that that seminary professors should function like elders. Therefore, they should have the same biblical qualifications as elders. And in his world, and in mine too, his conviction is that only men should be elders. Okay, so that's all in the background. He says that the proper demand on a seminary teacher is to be an embodiment of the pastoral offices. So the conversation that I want to have, Tal, is this. I want to talk about what's missing when we don't learn from women, and I want to talk about how we develop the practice as men listening to women. But here's what I want to say. This is not about Dr. Piper per se, but I want to challenge the assumption. Because I really do, all joking, ha ha ha. It's obvious at the side that we should learn from women. It doesn't happen a lot, and in a lot of context, in certain theological traditions. So, kind of our world that we would inhabit, sometimes embrace wholeheartedly, and other times kind of go, I don't know if I want to live in that tribe of that kind of reformed evangelical world, which is usually led by white men. So that's the setup. What is missing when we don't learn from women? We got a list of things here. Let's kind of walk through them. The first is this, that what's missing when we don't learn from women is emphasis on certain topics and issues. So here's what I'll do. I'll go through the list and I'll kind of lay it out there, and then you just riff on it. And when you see that, you fill in the blanks. Okay. So that's the first one. That what's missing is we don't emphasize certain topics and issues when men aren't learning from women.
I think that should be obvious to us, but it's not. Sadly, I think we're going to, break it down to this. How many times do you hear, sermon illustrations with sports metaphors? How often is the sermon based on a male character from the narrative of the Bible? There's not a lot of men doing a lot of sermons on female characters of the Bible. When we bring up women in the Bible, it's usually the hookers. To break it down, it's Rahab, is here we go. And we're gonna talk about how they tempted men. And so it's a very stilted narrative, that we have. It just absolutely happens to us. And so we're not talking about women's issues. We're not talking about, any of these things. And when the church has run this way, think back to all of the years that women were oppressed, as a gender, and Scripture was used as the authority to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and still is sometimes. So that's another topic for another day. And I'm thinking is yeah, is really the benefit and both of us going to Beeson Divinity School, and we talked about this
Mhm.
in a couple episodes ago with Pastor Jason Cook, who went to Beeson as well,
Mhm.
and he talked about the benefit that he had from different professors who were women at Beeson. So
Mhm.
we had that experience as well. I would say I
Mhm.
probably didn't glean the wisdom of that because of where I was in my own development, and I probably was bent out of shape that we had women professors.
Mhm.
So I confess and am learning
Mhm.
now.
Mhm.
But second thing is not just the emphasis on certain topics and perspectives, but the perspective on topics and issues. Are there one or two that kind of jump out at you when you think about a topic or issue that in the development, either in seminary or the ongoing development of a pastor or church leader, boy, we really need the perspective on women if we're going to get this right?
Well, I think it's something in an episode that we recently covered, just, what it's like to be a survivor of sexual abuse. That's more often than not a female. And we don't hear that. We don't get, let's go to a typical sermon on David and Bathsheba. How many times have we had anyone investigate what's Bathsheba's perspective? What's it like to be her? Go back to Tamar in Genesis. What's it like for a society? Her husband dies, and so she's just passed down to the next brother. Holy crap, what's that like? And then and he's perfectly fine to have sex with her as long as he doesn't get her pregnant. What's it like to be her? What's it like to to have those issues and be treated in that way? We just don't hear that. We're not open to that. And but why? Because we don't know it. And if we're not listening to women to hear, geez, what's it like to be disadvantaged? What's it like to be in a male dominated society in which you are underpaid, you aren't paid as equal, you aren't, and you are subject to sexual abuse at a much higher rate and sexual harassment. What's that like to be in that event? We just don't hear that.
Yeah, and I know that it's one of the things that I'm continuing to do in pastoring my church is that with our staff, with other women in our church, I am wanting to get their perspective, whether it's a biblical text. We have a woman
Mhm.
who's on our preaching team. She doesn't preach, she does research, but Christy is theologically sharp. She's really
Mhm.
gifted and helpful in terms of perspective. Having a director of operations who's a woman is very, very helpful for us
Mhm.
as we're trying to either navigate situations or think about how we lead in different areas and kind of getting the other side of that coin. So I think that's
Mhm.
true.
Real quick, I just want
Yeah,
to add it to probably the one of the biggest topics where men are teaching, preaching, if they're going to do it, is just sexuality.
yeah,
Holy cow, it is such a male slant because we're too scared to talk to women about that. And so just kind of historically, the church has tasked women with our chastity.
yeah.
It's their job to hold the lines because it's going to be men's job to charge those lines.
Yeah.
There's that default decision there.
I had this conversation with a woman in our church. We were talking about this as we're trying to dial this in, get this right, and I'm trying to
Mhm.
learn just in terms of talking and the whole issue about how we should relate men and women, all that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
she said, "Look, it comes down to this: if you're creepy, I don't want to talk to you about anything. If you're not creepy, I'll talk to you about practically anything."
Right. That's very
and
good.
and their radar is a lot stronger than you think, gentlemen.
Mhm.
So they
Mhm.
can usually cut through it pretty quickly.
Yep.
And so she told me a few things that for her, she's like, "This is how I know you're creepy or not," and
Mhm.
it's pretty funny. So here's the third thing that's missing when we don't learn from women. Third is preparation for serving at least half of the congregation, and that's
Right.
the part in Dr. Piper's statement that I was like, "Good freaking grief."
Mhm.
It is, and I know this from experience, that how much I had to learn, and even being somebody who's happily married, because I think this is what happens. You go,
Mhm.
I'm married, I'm happily married, I now understand women, right?
And then you wind up in my office.
Yes. So it's the challenge of all the things that it takes in order to
Mhm.
serve women in the congregation. And I'm not just talking about how we the interplay of sexuality in terms of our
Right.
interactions. I just mean everything that it takes and to be a servant leader. I just think that that's
Mhm.
missing so
Mhm.
often when we don't have
Mhm.
women who are training and developing us to lead well.
I agree. I think if you switch the issue right quick, this is something I do with clients all the time. We switch the drug, switch the issue, and let's make this race.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's like to be an African American male or female. And so I need their perspective. I need to hear from them. I need to learn from them. I need to be in dialogue with them. That's mutually beneficial. But if it's just a one way monologue, and I've got a mic, and I'm just jamming my perspective out there, there's so many blind spots there that could be removed, and the message could be so much more effective by having broader perspective and just listening. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything anybody says to you. It's just like, oh, can I learn about how they think through that?
Yeah.
And can I learn about what it's like to be, in their shoes? Can I get to that place and start just to understand and go, wow, yeah, that would be difficult. Then the preaching is going to be so much more effective, and your cultural information is going to grow. You're going to be more culturally educated. You're going to be able to speak from a more diverse perspective because you've gotten other input. I think what's frightening to me is anybody that decides that they suddenly know the perspective of another race or another gender because they've had one or two conversations.
Yeah. They read a book.
Yeah, and I've done this. More often than not, if I'm preaching on a weekend, I'm probably going to be in a black church.
Yeah.
I preach in black churches a lot, and I still make cultural missteps in
Sure.
that. I think one of the greatest mistakes I've made in recent years was preaching on a Good Friday service. It was the first time I'd been invited into a Good Friday service in an African American church. I assumed that, well, it's Good Friday. Nobody does like a really happy, upbeat Good Friday service. We'll do, a dark and somber, and leave in silence,
Yes.
liturgical white
Yeah. Right.
thing. And I mean, look, I gave a dark message. it was somber, dark, it was hard, it was all of those things, and I did not realize until as it was going, like, oh geez, I've made a horrible mistake. Here now, luckily there were 6 other preachers to I wasn't the only one, so there was 7 preachers there doing each of the last words, and so thankfully others got to clear up my error. But I didn't know, and it wasn't until I had a conversation with one of my closest friends who happens to be African American, and we were talking, and she was like, oh no, you can't do that. But that's a conversation I normally have with her before I ever do anything, and I just made the assumption that I knew. Well, of course they'll do it like we do it. No. And so just having the conversation can save a lot of embarrassment and a lot of misuse of sermonic time.
Yes.
That's not what they were looking for, and I came at them like, it was bad. It was bad.
One more we'll add here for those of you who consider yourself complementarian. We'll hook up a link up in the show notes to a talk by Jen Wilkin, who's out at the Village Church in the Dallas area. And it was a talk that I heard her give, where basically on the role of women in the church. And she said, if your church is complementarian and you're going to get this right, then you have to be as aggressive as you possibly can within your complementarianism to advocate for platform women and things like that. And so I think that when we are actively learning as men from women, we are creating a more robust complementarianism. Because I think we've had a complementarianism in theory that says we're complementary, but what's the complement there other than to serve, to be there to help, but to help in ways that aren't that it's really hard to see that there's any ontological equality. So again, those are just I think some things that are missing. So Tal, let's talk through a few ways to develop the practice of listening to women. The first one that we wrote down is this: that ask questions of women closest to you. So when you hear that for a church leader, and can we take out wives out of this? Because I'm going to think beyond that. So I'll go ahead and say that I'm a little troubled, particularly in non-denominational contexts. I see this in a lot in Acts 29 context, which I'm affiliated with,
Mhm.
somehow the wife is being automatically elevated to that role of first lady, even though we don't use that language, but
Mhm.
not in the
Mhm.
honor sense, almost in the co-pastor sense.
Yes.
Like we're beginning to see more and more and more within Acts 29 churches, wives of pastors about to become co-pastors and preachers. We were not going to use that
Mhm.
label, but all of a sudden they're teaching on the stage together and all
Mhm.
those kind of
Mhm.
thing. So I want to take wives out of this and go, because
Mhm.
your wife might not be wired that way, right?
Right.
To be that. So let's take the wives out of the equation. And who else should, as a minister, as somebody developing, maybe you're in seminary or you're out of seminary, like who else should we be listening to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to listen to women in the congregation. I think you need to, I think you need to be listening to women on your staff if you have any, and if you don't, you need to ask yourself why you don't. But it's just having conversations about perspectives, and really, at the end of the day, from my perspective, it is about seeking empathy. How can I find an empathetic connection with a gender? How can I understand more about them and their perspective, and how does that now color my preaching? I mean, Fosdick, I don't agree with almost any theological point of Harry Emerson Fosdick, but one of the things that I loved about him is he was the guy that he didn't have a preaching calendar. He didn't do any of that. He just said, I just believe if I hang out with the sheep enough during the week, I'll know what they need to eat on Sunday. But he wasn't just talking to the male sheep. So it's talking with the women. What are their problems? What are their challenges? We're missing so many opportunities to minister, and we're missing so many opportunities to be educated,
Yeah.
just because we're unwilling to be in conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll say this: if you are learning from women thought leaders outside the church,
Mm-hmm.
you're still going to miss some things,
Mm-hmm.
because the Beth Moores, the Ann Voss camps, the Jen Hatmakers, whoever is going to represent, a woman thought leader that you're willing to listen to or that you want to listen to,
Mm-hmm.
they're still wired differently than the woman than all the women in your church. Like, let's not do this. Like, there's no token black guy and there's no token women. There's like not just
Right.
one woman. You're like, I'm going to go
Right.
learn that. So we want to ask questions of women who are closest to us, the ones who go to our church, that live in our city,
Mm-hmm.
that live in our neighborhood, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Second, this kind of ties into what I said earlier. If you're going to listen to women, you need to include women in church leadership as aggressively as your complementarianism allows. So
Right.
if you're not going
Right.
to do men elders, that's fine, or if you're women elders, that's fine. You're going to have to explain it often, and
Mm-hmm.
clearly, and persuasively. But if you're not going to do that, and we don't in our church, and I have to do those things,
Mm-hmm.
then you need to be as aggressive as you possibly can in including them in very real leadership decisions and very real leadership conversations in your church.
Mm-hmm.
The third and the fourth are kind of they're two sides of one coin. Is one is you need to learn from women you can easily agree with.
Mm-hmm.
Second, you need to learn from women who challenge your ideas, opinions, and perspective.
Yeah.
Tal, what would you add to that?
I think that last one is almost as vital as anything else. And I think you do, everybody that you serve a disservice if you only have your viewpoint. You only read people or study people that you agree with. You're missing so much of an issue, and you're missing finding great clarity for why you believe what you believe. It's when it's read people, listen to people you disagree with, and can you do that peacefully? Just sit and listen and learn. But I think we just cut ourselves short if we don't read and engage with people we disagree with. And so I think you and I both saw, during our time in seminary, just how hard it was to be a female student at Beeson, let alone a female faculty member.
Yeah, and so this is where I would go. I'm a living embodiment of this. That I never went after anybody like aggressively, but I just didn't care. Like, I mean, I was just like, I mean, whatever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
are we here to train pastors? Like, why are we even doing this? I mean, you're not going to be a pastor, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just so many layers of dumb and so many layers of, not even so. I can even say this. not even layers of, from my perspective, being incorrect, okay, but
Mhm.
layers of a lack of empathy, and a lack of wisdom on my end in terms of how desperately I really did need that. And so it's a part of my training at Beeson that I really do believe that I missed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Ephesians is pretty clear. There in Christian community there is mutual submission.
Yeah.
I think we rape that text when we just bypass that little piece, and then women submit to your husband. You know, wives submit to your husbands. Whoa! Right before that, it's that whole passage is modeling gospel centered community, and it's a community that is selfless and a mutual submission to each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key point that gets missed an awful lot.
Yeah. So here's what's at stake. And again, ladies, if you've been listening to this, I hope that it's been helpful and encouraging to know that at least there are two guys in the world that are for you. I think there are more, but we're grateful for you as our sisters. We're grateful to be able to learn from you and in real ways to follow your leadership. But to the men who are listening to this, what's at stake for you, pal, is that if you don't learn from women, you're going to increasingly be obtuse and ham-handed with your leadership. You're just going to be that guy, and you think you're not. And if I was to ask the women in your church, in your ministry, if I was to ask the women around you, they would be nice to you. But they would go, yeah, you're missing the boat. Or you can take the opportunity to learn from women actively, and you will develop stronger convictions, and you will become more human.
Mm-hmm.
You're choose your own adventure, gentlemen. But this is really what's at stake. I want to help you with this a little bit. So we have a resource called, if you go to fivefactors.net/freedom, it will basically help you in all the noise that's going on in your world. If you're like, I need to figure out a way to do this, like I need to set aside some time to develop a way that I'm going to consistently, intentionally learn from women because it's not second nature to me yet, then go to fivefactors.net/freedom and download that resource. It's going to help you set a really clear goal and give you a very simple strategy for getting from where you are today to where you want to be in the next 90 days. We're big believers in incremental change, but incremental change doesn't come intuitively to a lot of us. And so that resource will help us. Okay. So the secret for us in this episode is pretty simple. Healthy leaders don't discriminate against wisdom. We'll take it from wherever we can get it. And there's a lot of wisdom to be found in the lives and experience and knowledge and perspective and genius and brilliance of women. So, Tal, you get the last word, my friend.
I don't want to add to that. I think that's it. You know, don't discriminate against wisdom. There's so much available to us. Don't be arrogant in thinking that you've got the market cornered. So let's listen to our sisters in Christ. Let's be mutually submissive, and we'll all grow from that.
That's great. All right, y'all. If you would do us a huge favor, if you have not left us a rating, it helps us in the big, beautiful Apple algorithm get this podcast to more leaders like you. If this episode or other episodes have been helpful, just going and clicking in the show notes, going where it just says rate and review, you just go there, leave us a rating. That'll help more leaders get access to this podcast and let them know that we exist. We want to help them like we're helping you. If you leave us a review, if you take 30 seconds, a minute, and leave us a review, would be helpful for us also. It would allow us to know that we are helping you, and feel free in that review to just say, hey, here's what I'd love to see more of. Here's what I'd love to see different. We're continuing to want to learn from you as well. Yeah. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, I would encourage you to do that. It just makes it real easy. You don't have to remember to go download an episode from us. It just shows up wherever you get your podcast. It shows up every Monday morning, ready to go. So next week we have a fun interview. Really, it was a fun and intriguing interview that I was able to do with Barnabas Piper. And really, I think it's going to be helpful for us as church leaders because here's somebody who grew up in the church. He's written a book on being a PK. He's written books on doubt. He's written books on curiosity. And I think it's going to give you a really interesting perspective on what it's like to be somebody who isn't a leader in a church, but just somebody who's showing up on Sundays for church. So I think it's a great conversation. Look forward to having that with you on the next episode. But until then, for myself, for Tal Prince, God bless you wherever you are. Hope you have a great day. We'll see you next week.